Welcome to another episode of Mahauliyati mukalmay, the dedicated podcast of the Climate and Environment Initiative at RSIL. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Sanval Nasim. Dr. Sanval is an assistant professor of economics at LUMS. He's an applied economist with an active research portfolio in the areas of environmental and natural resource economics and political economy. Dr. Nasim received his PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Economics and Policy from the University of California, Riverside. He studies citizens' behavior in response to deteriorating environment quality in developing countries and states' capacity in developing countries and how it relates to public good provision. Thank you for being with us today. So today we'll be talking about the dual threats of air pollution and climate change in Pakistan. And as South Asia's second fastest urbanizing country, Pakistan also ranked as the second most polluted country in the world in 2020. So before we go any further, Dr. Nasim, can you give us an idea of what we mean when we talk about air pollution and climate change and what the relationship between the two is?
Thank you, Maha. So that's a good question because I feel in our context, a lot of people conflate air pollution with climate change. Though there's a lot of overlap between air pollution and climate change when it comes to sources or when it comes to the kinds of policies that you need to address the two issues. But fundamentally, it helps to kind of see them as two distinct problems. So air pollution in many ways is more localized, and localized in the sense that, emissions, PM 2.5, which is the most egregious pollutant, for example, PM 2.5 emissions in Lahore would either affect residents of Lahore or surrounding areas, but doesn't necessarily affect people far away, right? But climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Now, greenhouse gas emissions themselves, gases like carbon dioxide, methane, etc. Now, these gases themselves are not harmful when you breathe them, but they go and accumulate in the atmosphere. And when they do, that leads to what we call, it raises temperatures, and emissions across the globe affect each other. So that's why we call it a global phenomenon, right? Because emissions in the US will predominantly harm people in South Asia, for example. Right? So that's why in many ways it's important to kind of distinguish between climate change and air pollution, because the kind of response that's required or the kind of policy actions that are required are fundamentally quite different. On climate change, you need global action. You need countries to get together and devise, commit to, on the mitigation side, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they have to commit to reducing their emissions. But also they have to think about channeling resources and creating those funds where more vulnerable countries, which also tend to be much poorer compared to the biggest emitters, how they're going to adapt or become more resilient in response to the changing climate. Air pollution, on the other hand, like I said, is a local problem. And so in Pakistan, for example, we need local policies to kind of think about how do we address this, right? So I can come back to that later. But in terms of thinking about climate change and air pollution, I think it's fundamentally very important to kind of think about these as two distinct issues. There is overlap for sure, and a lot of policies that you can use or leverage to address air pollution could also help you kind of mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But when we're trying to dissect the problem and thinking about policy responses, we need to kind of keep that, or we need to be very particular about the fact that the policy response for these two issues is going to be fundamentally different.
And then when you do conflate the two issues of air pollution and climate change, then individuals are more likely to feel like with climate change, for example, mitigation isn't the most important issue for Pakistan, it's adaptation. So if you conflate the two, then individuals believe that air pollution, they're not really contributing to it. But as you said, if it's a localized problem, then they definitely are. And we need to think about how we can reduce air pollution on an individual level.
That's another really great point. And I'm glad you bring that up because, looking at the kind of conversations we've been having in Pakistan the past few years, again, people are conflating the two. But just as an example, a few years ago, they started with these urban forests. I don't know if you recall that policy, but that, they had this sort of civic engagement thing in the and it was done by the Punjab government, and they were creating these urban forests in cities like Lahore, Islamabad, etc. But the kind of conversations that were happening around that, and that too by people who were leading these initiatives, was that these forests are going to control air pollution. And this is going to be like a solution to our air pollution problem, which is ridiculous. Because, the fact is, at both climate change and when you think about climate change and air pollution, the scale of these issues is just so large. Now, these kind of ad hoc steps, planting forests is a noble action. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't be planting urban forests, but you can't sell that as a strategy to clean our air, because fundamentally, the only way you're going to clean our air is when you're going to get polluters to stop polluting, right? Now, that is where the real challenge lies. Identifying who the polluters are, figuring out what are the incentives that lead them to pollute. Then how do we kind of disincentivize them to pollute, right? And so, or how do we leverage price-based policies? Like, should we tax their pollution or not? In the U.S., they're using, not the U.S., but in U.S. and other countries, they're now experimenting with market-based techniques like pollution permits, for example, right? So those tend to be, and I'll come back to that later too, in economic jargon, what we call cost-effective. And our existing policies, the policies that we have on paper to address air pollution, aren't necessarily cost-effective. I'll just park that for now, and I'll address that in a bit. But the forests, you can't sell them as a initiative or a strategy to reduce pollution. And the other thing, I think the mistake that they made was they made it seem as if, a lot of people talk about, how we're not responsible for climate change, and then people shouldn't tell us what to do or what not to do. The fact is, yes, we're not the amongst the biggest emitters, but we're really vulnerable to effects, right? And it's just the consequence of geography. And you can't do anything about that. So the fact is, global temperatures are going to go up. That target that we, or the world set itself, 1.5 degrees till 2050 or something, a lot of people know that that's not going to be achievable. Very, very difficult given the status quo. And given that, you have to face reality, which is that, these effects we're already experiencing these effects, and they're going to perhaps snowball going forward. And we need to learn how to adapt, right? And that's what you just mentioned earlier. And planting forests is a way to adapt. It's a way to adapt because it gives shade. So think about the workers who work outside. When it's super hot, their productivity goes down, etc. They stop working. They need shade. They need some place to sit down and regain their strength. And there's evidence. There's a lot from Indonesia, and this is very good experimental evidence demonstrating that farmers or outside workers, when they have access to trees, they're able to rest, they're able to regain their energy, and then are more productive than workers and farmers who don't have access to these things, right? And similarly, planting trees also, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but people claim, or urban planners claim, that planting these forests do decrease temperatures in that particular area by a few degrees. But that's how I see urban forests. I see that as an urban strategy to make, again, it goes back to this idea of creating smarter cities, and having urban forests is important. But let's not sell that as a solution to our air pollution problems, what we've been doing. What that does is that it takes us away from actually away from the actual polluters, the actual source of the problem. And that's where we need to kind of divert our energy.
And I think part of the reason why there's such popular solutions in Pakistan, especially, is it's easier to implement, right? Like it's easier for us to talk about planting trees than it is to talk about implementing the policies we have and making sure that the people who pollute stop polluting, because that's quite hard for you to get support for, especially with that balance between economic growth and the environment that we have to manage in Pakistan.
Yeah, totally. It's policies are always hard, but it's not as if Pakistan doesn't have poor policies. Especially when it comes to the environment. If you look at the history of environmental legislation, it's actually pretty rich. And on paper, we do have solid rules and regulations. We've got these standards that we've set. We've got the law has a provision for environmental protection councils, which sit and have they're the oversight body of the environmental protection departments, etc. So in some ways we do have laws and rules and regulations around us, but having that on paper is a fundamentally very different thing than actually seeing implementation of the same policies or rules and regulations. And that has to do with the fact that these rules and regulations are basically operating within a very weak institutional structure, right? Our environmental protection departments, which are mandated by law to enforce environmental standards, don't have, they really have very few resources. I did this little piece on like the history of like air pollution or air quality management in Pakistan, and I demonstrated it's only like less than 1% of the provincial budget that goes to the environmental protection department, right? And that's what they have to use. It's the Environmental Protection Department is responsible. After the 18th Amendment, environment is now gone into the provincial domain, right? So they on a budget less than 1%, and they're responsible for the environmental management of the entire province. Yeah. It's impossible to do that with the kind of resources they have. So because of that, they have really weak enforcement and monitoring mechanisms. So once you have standards, you've basically mandated a legal limit in law, right? It's kind of like speed limits, like on the motorway when you say like, your speed limit is 120 kilometers an hour. Fact is that, that's the law, but you can easily break that if you want. And if you don't have the motorway police, then, people can drive at whatever speeds they want. And it's the same thing with the standards is that, if you look at our PM 2.5, well, I think the Punjab government doesn't even have that. PM 2.5, which is the most egregious pollutant, for example, they don't have an industrial standard for that. What they do have is an ambient air quality standard for PM 2.5. But I mean, that's basically saying that the limit is 35 micrograms per meter cube per day. But we also have an annual standard, which is, I think, close to 10 or 15 micrograms per meter cube. So what these standards suggest is that on an annual average has to be less than 15 or 10 micrograms per cube, but there's a provision that on certain days you can pollute. So that's why the daily average is higher, right? Okay. But that's why it's 35 micrograms per meter cube. But then if on many days you're close to 35, then on a lot of other days you have to make sure you're well below that so that the annual average is between 10 and 15. But the fact is, if you look at air quality readings from Lahore, it's very hard to find a day when air pollution has been less than 50 micrograms per meter cube, right? It's at atrocious levels throughout the year, perennial. It's not just a winter phenomenon, it's a summer thing too. Throughout the year, our PM 2.5 levels in the city and many other cities in the country are at hazardous levels, right? And so as I was saying, these guys have that standard, but they just really don't have the capacity to monitor and enforce that. And that's a tragedy of like policy making, not just when it comes to the environment, but for a lot of other kind of departments too.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about the extent of the air pollution problem in Pakistan, but what are the major causes of air pollution in Pakistan? Is it industry? Is it individuals?
Right.
Is there enough data to tell?
Yeah, good question. And the simple answer is we actually don't have enough data. So to get a good sense of emissions, scientists conduct what we call source apportionment studies. So, and so you collect samples. I mean, there are different ways of doing source apportionment. But one of the most popular ways is you collect samples, and this is the job of the Environmental Protection Department, by the way. So if you look at the US, environmental protection is really decentralized. So even at the city levels or county levels, you have, environmental protection departments, and they go and like collect air samples, and they're, they put them under the microscope, and then they get a, good sense of, what the pollutants are and what the sources are, right? But for us, our Environmental Protection Department hasn't conducted a single source apportionment study. So the EPD itself has no idea what our sources are and what are they contributing. So the most popular study that's quoted in power, everybody quotes that study, is this 2018 FAO study, and FAO is an arm of the UN. Basically, what they did wasn't source apportionment. They actually looked at remote sensing data. And remote sensing is fundamentally very different from source apportionment. And they took that data, and so we've got sort of crude numbers around what are the sources of pollution in Punjab. And what this study shows is that vehicular emissions, so vehicles are the number one source of PM 2.5. That's about 43%, I believe. After that is industries, and I'm blanking out on the number, but then
I think 25%.
25, yeah. And then it's followed by, I think, power, and then finally agriculture. Yeah.
And then obviously we don't have enough data, so I guess our first mitigation strategy to really combat air pollution would be to collect more data. But other than that, could you give us an idea of what measures there are that individuals and then institutions can take to reduce air pollution?
Look, again, the one could argue that you can incentivize behavioral change in individuals, and that might contribute to improving air quality. But the fact is that, again, the scale of the problem is just so large that, individual actions are they're just not going to work. So you do need like a stronger response than that. So individuals who pollute, it's a reaction to incentives, right? The reason people pollute, by the way, is, in economics, it's what we call a standard common pool resource problem. The air is a common pool resource. It's if you think of industries, when industries pollute, air pollution, or the pollution that comes out of those industries, is you can think of that as that's waste, but that waste goes into the air. And so the air is providing a service. It becomes a repository of that waste, but these guys are not paying for that, right? So there's value to having air, which is it's acting as this repository for the waste. And so firms they're generating, they're making output, and they're making a profit off of what they're producing. They're paying for all the other inputs and services, but this service that the air is providing is something that they're not paying for, right? If they were to pay for it, then they might think about reducing their, changing the habits or the way they produce their products, or installing technologies, etc. But the fact is, the bottom line is they're not paying for that service that air is providing, and so they over pollute. So that's your standard common pool resource problem, right? Now, to address that, we need to think about, so here's a common pool resource problem, and there's, several ways of seeing how you can fix this. You're a lawyer, so you probably know that whole common pool resource problem arises because of a lack of property rights. So can we think about ways where we can define property rights? We do that very easily with natural resources like land, or maybe perhaps even water, with forests. But there's no reason why we can't do that with air. And once we do that, then we have a valuable right that can be distributed, that can be exchanged and bought and sold, etc. So that those who really need to pollute are then actually made to pay for the right to discharge their pollutants in this in the air. Another way of targeting this is through charges. Right. So you have, for every unit of pollution that these firms produce, this rests in what we call the polluter pays principle. That if you pollute, then you got to compensate everyone else for doing that. So for every unit of pollution, you pay a tax or a charge, which is then reinvested in society, right? And so, if the tax is high enough, then the polluters are incentivized to cut down on their emissions. So these are the kind of sort of general, these are the two sort of broad market-based responses. The more traditional response to combating air pollution is what we call a command and control approach. And that's what our government currently uses. A command and control approach is what I said earlier, is basically you mandate some sort of a figure in law, some threshold in law, and then basically just say that you can't go beyond this threshold, you can't pollute beyond this threshold, and then you use the strong arm of the state or state machinery to enforce the mandates or the standards that you've set, right? So that's what we do now. The Environmental Protection Department has a bunch of standards, and it's and it's mandated by law to then ensure that it's that polluters or whoever are like meeting those standards. But like I said, it's just they don't have the resources or capacity to like really enforce that.
Yeah, so then it's a governance problem where we need to be investing more in the departments, making sure that they have the human resources to actually carry out their
Right. One of them is even if, okay, I'm glad you bring this up. Even if, let's say, the Environmental Protection Department have the resources, so you're able to staff it well, and like it has 100% monitoring and enforcement capacity. Even then, a standards approach, a command and control approach, is very costly, and the reason it's costly is because different polluters have different costs of reducing pollution. The word we use is abatement. So different polluters have different abatement costs. But standards are all uniform. It's not that you have a different standard for different polluters. Everyone faces the same standards. But there's some people for whom it's far more costly to reduce emissions than others, right? So there might be firms that are newer, have newer technologies. For them, it might be really, really cheap to reduce their pollution or their emissions. But there might be these old firms with old technologies, old habits, and managerial skills or whatever. Perhaps perhaps it's really costly for these firms to reduce their emissions. So so if you add up all these costs, because everyone faces a uniform standard, this balloons. This really inflates the costs that society bears for like enforcing the standards. That's why economists are so into the market-based approach, is because once you have a charge, let's say, if you start charging every polluter for what their emissions are, then those polluters are going to weigh the costs of those, what it costs. See, if they reduce their emission, they have to incur costs, right? Because they have to clean up those emissions. But once they do that, they don't have to pay that additional tax because they're reducing emissions. So the emissions are going down, they're decreasing, so they're paying lower taxes as a result, or charges as a result. So they weigh those taxes against their abatement costs, and every polluter is going to do that. And so the eventually the abatement costs, marginal abatement costs become equal across firms. And you can demonstrate when that happens. I won't go into more technical details, but when marginal abatement costs are equal across polluters or sources, then the total abatement costs for society are the lowest. So in practice, of course, you might not be able to ensure that marginal costs are equalized across sources, but this is far more cost effective than a standards approach where everyone's facing a uniform standard.
And then one of the other reasons that it's preferred, I think, by firms is because it leaves them that choice of what to do.
Yeah.
So like you said,
yeah.
whether to pay the
Right.
amount or whether to use clean technology
Right.
versus command, of course, which puts them at you have to use the exact same structure as everybody else.
Right. No, great point. Command and control policies are often much more nuanced than this too, right? They also they have mandates on emissions, standards on emissions, but they also often have like mandates on technologies. So then that constrains firms because then they have to basically like adopt technologies that the government's mandating. So it takes away the flexibility to do things the way they want to, right? So charges gives them that flexibility because hey, you're targeting, so as the regulator, you're basically focusing on pollution, not necessarily the habits of the firms or the polluters. So you're setting the charge and then you're letting these agents, the firms or individuals, respond to that charge. And they have that flexibility to do, they can adopt whatever technology they want to, they can change their own practices, they can perhaps buy better inputs, maybe make their workers more adept at the production process or the stuff that they do at the firms or at the factories, etc. So, there's a lot of inbuilt incentives for the firms to do things independently versus, like you said, under a standards approach where you really get straitjacketed by the law.
So is this approach then used in a lot of other countries? Because like you said, it's not implemented in Pakistan, but do we have examples of other developing countries that are successfully using it?
On air pollution, India, by the way. So India has really started experimenting with new ways of addressing its PM 2.5 problem or its air pollution problem. Indian cities too rank among some of the most polluted cities in the world. But in the state of Gujarat, they're experimenting with the first PM 2.5 tradable permits system. Okay. So the tradable permit system is sort of similar to the charge system that I told you about, but instead of charging firms, what happens is you allocate the right to emit to firms. These are called permits. So you allocate these permits to firms, and then the firms trade these permits in a market. So if there are enough firms, then this market becomes pretty competitive. And what happens is permits flow from those who need it most to those who don't really need them, right? And so the price that's set eventually in the market is equivalent to that hypothetical tax or charge we would have set. So the state of Gujarat, it's experimenting with the first PM 2.5 permit market in the world. So that's a I think it's a huge step. A lot of the developed countries have actually done exceptionally well in improving their air quality. So they perhaps don't really necessarily need these kind of strategies anymore. For example, the U.S. after the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, the U.S. used to have really terrible air pollution too. But it was really in the 70s after the Clean Air Act, they really invested in sort of air quality institutions and like democratizing the process. And a bunch of steps that they took in the last 50 years that now in the U.S. citizens are breathing the cleanest air that they ever have since the U.S. started monitoring air quality and water quality. So they're breathing the cleanest air and drinking the cleanest water since this data became available, right? So, but what the U.S. and Europe, they're leveraging taxes or permit systems permit markets for greenhouse gas emissions,
Right.
because a country like the U.S. hasn't done well. So it has done well when it comes to localized pollution like PM 2.5 or sulfur dioxide, and so for again things that deteriorate air quality. But and it's done that because it had a solid policy. A solid policy, then it refined and it polished over 50 years and was well implemented, and you can see the results. But what the US never had was a solid policy on greenhouse gas emissions, right? So you can see that it's one of the biggest emitters, and it's really kind of struggling to reduce its carbon footprint. But they're open to the idea. Some of the states, by the way, I think California and there's some other states, they are on an exchange where they can trade permits, carbon permits, and so they're using the permit system to reduce emissions. But it's not across the country. It just involves a few states, and I think some provinces in Canada. But the European Union also has its own permit trading scheme, etc. So when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, you can see there's far more action in terms of leveraging market-based strategies in the high-income countries, which is something that we can use as an example and perhaps try to emulate too.
I definitely think it would be interesting to see how that would apply to Pakistan, and hopefully there is more research in the future on this in Pakistan. But we talked a lot about how to reduce air pollution. But now let's move a little to the individuals and how air pollution really affects people in Pakistan. And do people, because your research is related to this, do people realize the effect of air pollution on their health or their livelihoods, for example?
Yeah. Well, on really polluted days, I'm sure people do experience the effects, right? So especially in the winter months when air quality levels are really hazardous. See, I don't have precise data here, and again, one should look into this. What are the, how one should look at hospitalization rates and see how many people check in for lung-related problems, like asthma or bronchitis, etc. But we have enough evidence now. I mean, this is PM 2.5, again, the most egregious pollutant. It's just, let me just tell you what it is. It's PM stands for particulate matter. 2.5 is just the size of this particle. Now these could be small oily substances or solid substances, but these are like, they're smaller than 1/10 of a diameter of a strand of hair. They're really tiny particles, and so when you inhale them, they easily enter your bloodstream. And once they do that, I mean, they can, it increases the risk of all kinds of morbidities and mortality. So in terms of life expectancy, given our existing levels of PM 2.5, an average Lahori would lose approximately 6 years of their life, right? And this is 6 years of not being with family and losing out on the chance of being in this world, and that's just because of poor air quality, right? But in terms of morbidities, though, it's not just lung diseases and a high risk of cancer, etc., for the highly sensitive and vulnerable, but now we know the sort of that PM 2.5 also causes severe cognitive disabilities. So if you have young kids and they're exposed to high levels of PM 2.5, that really stunts their brain growth. And on polluted days, for example, students perform really poorly on math and English tests compared to cleaner days. So it's not just affecting your health, but it's also leading to poor school outcomes and academic outcomes, and a lot of these things add up, right? This is the short-term cost, but if you fail on your exam, that has long-term repercussions. And a person who has stunted brain growth might not even get that opportunity. So, it's the effects, the consequences are incredibly severe.
Yeah, I didn't know that it affects cognitive ability, and that is very scary. And I think if we look at it on a large scale, then with working professionals, then it would hamper your productivity. It would reduce your ability to get work done. So that's actually quite interesting. There's an economic and social cost to it, as well as the individual health costs.
Yeah, also for workers, there's evidence that shows that on polluted days, labor productivity falls. So you have less productive workers, which means you have less output and lower incomes, etc. So there's a wide variety of costs associated with air pollution. And a lot of these kind of they snowball and can be quite disastrous.
And so, given the effects, what can individuals do to protect themselves?
Right. So we're coming back into the adaptation domain. I wish I was a more optimistic person. Sadly, I'm not. So I don't think that in Punjab or Lahore we'll be able to improve our air quality in the long run, at least. In the short run, but I don't think we're going to be doing it in the long term either. It really requires us to put in the required resources to build that monitoring enforcement capacity. But given how weak our institutional setting here is, I just don't see it happening anytime soon. Now, we can't just give up, right? So if we won't be able to clean our air, at least we can take steps to avoid pollution. And that's what a lot of my research these days is on pollution avoidance. So one is, of course, particular filtering masks, right? Yeah. So in our research, we're demonstrating that people have willingness to pay for these for this good. It's not, and I'm talking about an average Lahori. So we went and did field surveys, we have a field experiment happening, and we demonstrated people have considerable willingness to pay for this mask. Okay. On average, the price might be lower than the retail price, but with a little bit of subsidy, you'll be able to get the average person to actually procure the mask. So people should be investing in these PM 2.5 masks and wearing them. The other is time use. Time use is when you limit your exposure to outside air. So instead of going to work on a regular, if it's polluted, you might decide to actually take the day off if it's really polluted, or spend more time indoors versus outdoors, or just limit outdoor activities for a short while until you feel air pollution is improved. So there's that. In order to engage in better time use, again, you need access to good data. The Environmental Protection Department in Lahore is terrible at providing data. It uploads a lot of the data on its website, and then even then, it's not visible on the homepage. You have to go on sort of different pages on the website to kind of get a sense of where that data is. I mean, an average person can't do that, right? An average Lahori can't navigate that website to begin with. Often they just don't report data, and so people are very skeptical about the authenticity of the data that they're sharing, right? Then you have so this has opened the space for private providers. So you have those IQ Air Visual app. If you open that up, you'll see a lot of individuals have bought these low-cost PM 2.5 monitors, and they've installed them in their offices or at their homes, and they're providing kind of real-time data on air quality. But again, that's accessible through so they often, the thing is, they just report PM 2.5. Sometimes you want to know, you need to know data on other pollutants like ozone. So, for that, you need much more sophisticated devices. The EPD has them, But people are, like I said, there's a lack of trust in government data, right? So people don't often trust that kind of data that the EPT provides. The American consulate in Lahore, in fact, all consulates and the embassy, so there are two well, I think the US has 3 consulates in Lahore, Karachi and Peshawar, and then it has its embassy in Islamabad. So the US government has this initiative to gather air quality data across the world, and it's doing that through its embassies and consulates. So the consulates and embassy in Pakistan have these sophisticated Air Now monitors installed. Perhaps that's the most sophisticated monitor in Lahore right now. And that relays real-time information on PM 2.5 on the Air Visual app. They also tweet about that. You can also find that on their website. But ideally, what should happen is that an average citizen should either get these readings through an SMS message on their phone, or our newscasters, you know how news reports weather every day, they should be reporting air quality data along with that. So these are kind of some of the broader adaptation kind of strategies that or the key adaptation strategies that I think we should be focusing on.
And because one of the major issues of adaptation is that it's never equal. Of course, if you're in a higher income household, you're more likely to have an air purifier, you're more likely to have access to masks.
Exactly.
So then beyond the individual, I think it's the institution that needs to step in to help lower income people from being affected by air pollution.
Yeah. No, exposure is definitely an equity problem. Like you've said, those who are well off can actually engage in that sort of time use that we're talking about, right? Taking the day off or not going outside. They can then invest in air purifiers. Air purifiers they're an expensive device. Not everyone can afford them. And like I said, people do have a willingness to pay. This is evidence that we've generated through our research. They have willingness to pay for these particulate filtering masks, these PM 2.5 masks, or N95 masks, I would call them. But those masks the average citizen is still not able to afford it because the retail price is just slightly higher than their willingness to pay for it. So this is where we need to think, equities, often markets can't address issues of equity. Markets are very good at addressing issues of efficiency, but equity is hard. And that's where you always need intervention, right? So that's why I think you have to think about what are the kind of subsidies that we can provide, those at the bottom quintiles, or those, at the median, anyone below the median quintile, to get a sense of their willingness to pay for these things. And if they can't, how do we subsidize them to at least buy masks? And how do we get them to engage in better time use, receive this information? Because, you and I can just download the Air Visual app and get a good sense of what the air pollution, these guys can't. So how do we provide them this information without them having to pay for it, etc.? So those are the areas where there's a lot of inequity which needs to be, you're right, addressed through an institutional response.
And I think one other issue that we'll see in the future is mass migration from the most polluted cities to other cities. You already see people choosing to move their families from Lahore to Islamabad for the cleaner air. So the government needs to recognize that this is likely to happen in the future. It's already happening. And figure out how to manage it, or how to make sure that the least well-off aren't disadvantaged by it. In
terms of migration, you're right, there's always a trade-off. We're witnessing a lot of climate migration already. But that's climate change induced, right? Where it's just becoming impossible to survive in certain areas, right? Where there's temperatures have just gone through the roof, or where you just don't have access to water, where you have extended periods of drought, etc. So you're witnessing climate migration, but there's also evidence of air pollution migration, like you've said. First witnessed in China, where a lot of the industrial towns became super, super polluted, and then you saw a lot of people moving out because their productivity had fallen, they were getting sick. And so, like you said, it seems we do have anecdotal evidence in Pakistan that people are moving from more polluted cities to others. But then the trade-off is, is also sources of income, right? So it might be polluted in Lahore, but then if you decide to move to Islamabad, you're not really sure if you actually you'll be able to make that same sort of income or even find a job. So people are always weighing these kind of benefits and costs, right, for making those decisions. But but it is a problem that if there is migration, the question we need to ask ourselves is, are our cities able to withstand that impact? Yeah. Even in a polluted city like Lahore, we do see a lot of like rural migration, right? So people are moving to Lahore in search of better opportunities because it's a big urban center. They feel it has like more job opportunities, etc. But then just look at the way we've developed Lahore. It's contributing to further air pollution. Yeah. So instead of consolidating the city, perhaps thinking about a smarter design, investing in public transportation, we're essentially investing in sprawl. And so once the city kind of sprawls out, you get more cars and more roads, and there's hence more fuel being burned. And as a result, you not only get more greenhouse gas emissions, but given how poor vehicular emissions, as we know, is the number one cause of PM 2.5. The PM 2.5 levels go up as well, etc. Right? So it's kind of we're kind of stuck in this kind of weird loop where there's migration happening into the city, but we're also not thinking about investing enough in a smarter design, right? So I know it's a big challenge.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, hopefully we'll see more research on this in the future, more people working on it, and we'll get some solutions that can be implemented, that will be implemented.
But there's a political economy angle to this too, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's not that all policymakers are kind of evil or kind of, sort of dumb and they don't get these things. That's not the case. I think they too, to some extent, understand these things. But, often a housing society builders are very powerful people and really well connected. So the sprawl that you witnessed is them exerting power to some extent, right? So curtailing that power and the influence of real estate moguls or real estate institutions is a very difficult thing in our current political milieu, right? So, but I mean, there's nothing wrong in having aspirations, mm-hmm. And I think the smarter, greener Lahore is what we all should be aspiring to, and one with really good public transportation.
Mm-hmm. And I think you have to keep that optimism with you, otherwise you just can't survive.
Yeah, no, again, I think there's a lot of heterogeneity on this. Like I said, I'm very pessimistic. So I think people should be adapting. But you're right. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll end up with a clean, smarter Lahore in a few years.
But thank you so much for this discussion. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot of things. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. And please tune in for our next episode as well.